on the morning of February 14, 1879, in a small farming hamlet in Schoharie County, New York. Three neighbors forced open the frozen door of a single-story clapboard house. There, they discovered something that three separate physicians, two county coroners, and one Albany professor of medicine would spend the rest of their lives refusing to explain. A 26-year-old woman had been reduced from the shoulders downward to a fine gray ash torture musicator that held the exact shape of her body against the floorboards. Her head, her left forearm, and one stockinged foot remained completely untouched. The chair where she had been sitting showed only slight scorching. The wooden floor beneath her bore a dark oval stain no larger than a serving platter. And not a single curtain, book, or the oil lamp 3 feet from her elbow had caught fire. Her name was Ruth Paine. What happened to her inside that locked house during the coldest night of that winter was reported in 4 county newspapers, debated in at least 11 medical journals, and then, within 18 months, deliberately erased from every official record the county possessed. Before we continue with the story of Ruth Paine and the house on Cobble Hill Road, if you are hearing this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us which state or city you are listening from tonight. We want to know where our listeners are, because what you are about to hear was nearly buried forever. And the people who tried to bury it had more reasons than you can imagine and more power than you would like to believe a handful of ordinary men could ever have possessed. To understand what happened to Ruth Paine, you first have to understand the place she lived in, because the place itself becomes a kind of character in this story. Without it, nothing that followed would make any sense at all. Schoharie County in the late 1870s was a patchwork of Dutch stone houses and Yankee clapboard farms tucked into the folded hills west of Albany. A country of long valleys and short tempers. German Palatine families, who had arrived 150 years earlier, still spoke a rough Low Dutch dialect at home, using English only in church and at the market. The land was old for America, settled before the Revolution, cleared of oak and hickory by the grandfathers of the men now farming it. In many places, the stone walls marking pasture edges were already sinking back into the earth. The county seat was a sleepy town of shops, a courthouse, and a dairy exchange. But the hamlet where Ruth lived, a cluster of 7 houses and a Methodist chapel known locally as Cobble Hollow, was not on most maps. It sat at the end of a wagon road that became impassable between December and March. In winter, the only way out was a sled track cutting north, across the frozen brook, toward the mill at Breakabin. Cobble Hollow was the kind of place where a family could vanish into the snow without the county offices noticing for a month. The people who lived there had long ago learned to prefer it that way. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was, by every surviving account, the worst in 40 years. The thermometer at the Breakabin post office recorded 28 degrees below zero on the night Ruth Paine died. Snow had been falling off, and on since the first week of November. Drifts against the north side of the chapel stood taller than a man. The roof of the Kesarick farm had collapsed under their weight in early January. Children were not sent to the one-room school for weeks at a time. Old men died in their sleep and were stored, wrapped in canvas, in cold parlors until the ground thawed enough for burial. It was a winter that music pressed down on the hamlet like the palm of a great hand. Those who lived through it would speak of it decades later, as if it had been a single long night from which no one fully woke. Ruth had come to Cobble Hollow 3 years earlier as a young bride. She was born Ruth Vosberg in the Mohawk Valley, daughter of a Dutch Reformed minister who died of consumption when she was 19. She had taught school in Amsterdam, New York for 2 winters before meeting Daniel Paine at a Grange Hall dance in the autumn of 1875. Her father had been a stern man, a preacher of the old predestinarian school. He had taught Ruth to read Latin and Greek before she was 12. Her mother died when Ruth was 5, leaving behind a single daguerreotype of a dark-haired, schmusic young woman in a lace collar, and a small collection of poetry books that Ruth carried with her, tied in a bundle with a ribbon, everywhere she went for the rest of her life. Daniel Paine was 9 years her senior, a widower with a stone farmhouse and 90 acres of pasture inherited from his father, a quiet man whose first wife had died in childbirth 2 years before. By all surviving accounts, he was a decent and hard-working farmer, a deacon of the Methodist chapel, a man who drank nothing stronger than cider, and was known in the hamlet for the patience with which he broke his own horses to harness. Ruth accepted his proposal within 4 months. She moved her few trunks of books and linens into the Paine farmhouse in the spring of 1876. Those who knew her in Cobble Hollow described her in the careful phrases that farming communities reserve for women they cannot quite place. She was too educated for a farmer's wife, they said. She read books late into the night by the kitchen lamp. The yellow light of that lamp could be seen from the road until 2 and 3 in the morning. A small, steady square against the enormous darkness of the surrounding hills. She kept a journal in a cedar box beside her bed. She had studied French at the Amsterdam Academy and corresponded by mail coach and rail with at least 3 women in Albany and 1 in New York City, whose names did not appear in any church register in the county. She was not unfriendly. She attended the chapel every Sunday morning, sitting in the 3rd pew from the front with her gloved hands folded over a small black prayer book. She sang in a thin, surprisingly sweet soprano that carried over the deeper voices of the farmers around her. She brought preserves to the sick. She taught the small Cobble Hollow Sunday school class of 7 children. By the account of one woman who had been among them and lived until 1937, the children adored her with a fierce loyalty that rural children reserve for any adult who treats them, as if they might one day become interesting. But still, the neighbors would later tell the coroner, quite one of them, there was a stillness in her that they did not know what to do with, a way she had of looking at a conversation from a slight distance, as if she were listening for something underneath the words. It made the older women of the hamlet uneasy without their being able to say why. And there was something else. Something only 2 of her neighbors would say out loud, and only after great hesitation, and only after the doctor from Albany had sat across from them at their own kitchen tables, and asked the same quiet, patient questions 3 and 4 times over. In the last 6 months of her life, Ruth Paine had changed. She had grown thinner. Her cheekbones, always prominent, had become sharper. Dark hollows had appeared beneath her eyes that had not been there the previous summer. She had stopped wearing her wedding bonnet to church, replacing it with a plain black shawl drawn up over her head like a much older woman. She had been seen twice walking alone along the frozen brook at dusk in weather no sensible woman should have been walking in. Arms wrapped tight around her body, her breath trailing white behind her in the cold air. On 3 separate occasions, the woman in the nearest house, a widow of 62 years who had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 sons, and who did not, by her own description, miss much of what went on in the hamlet, had heard raised voices coming from the Paine farmhouse in the hours after midnight. Ruth's voice, the widow said, and Daniel's voice, and sometimes a 3rd voice, a man's voice, that the widow did not at first recognize. Each time, the widow had stood at her bedroom window in her nightgown, looking out across the snowy yard toward the Paine house. Each time, she saw a single square of yellow light burning in the kitchen window. And each time, she saw shadows moving across that light in a way she would later describe as resembling a slow and terrible music dance. Each time, she went back to bed, pulled the quilt up around her shoulders, and pretended she had not heard anything at all. Because a widow of 62 in a hamlet of 7 houses does not interfere with what happens in another woman's kitchen in the middle of the night. Even when the sounds coming through the winter air are sounds she does not want to hear. She would regret that silence. She would later tell Dr. Ten Eyck on her back porch on a July afternoon for every remaining day of her life. But regret, she added in the same breath, is a poor kind of penance. The Lord would judge her for what she had not done the same, as he would judge the others for what they had. The morning of February 14th began for Daniel Paine at 4:15, when the cold woke him in the upstairs bedroom, and he discovered his wife was not beside him. This, by itself, was not unusual. Ruth had been sleeping poorly for weeks, and had taken to going downstairs in the small hours to sit by the kitchen stove and read. Daniel dressed in the dark, pulling on wool trousers over his long drawers and lacing the heavy boots he wore against the cold. He came down the narrow staircase with a kerosene lantern held out before him. The house was entirely silent. The parlor, as he passed through it, was dark and still, the sheet-covered furniture looming like pale crouching animals in the lantern light. The kitchen door at the far end of the parlor was closed. Daniel later swore, under 3 separate examinations by 3 separate officials, that when he opened that door, the room beyond was cold. Not merely cool, as a farmhouse kitchen often was before dawn, but bitterly cold. The cold of a room with no fire for hours. The stove, a heavy cast, iron Union box stove with nickel-plated trim that Daniel had bought at the county fair in 1876, had gone out sometime in the night. The oil lamp on the table was extinguished, its wick black and curled. The window above the dry sink was clouded with a thin film of frost on the inside. Fern, like crystals, had grown across the lower panes in delicate patterns. And in the rocking chair beside the stove, where Ruth habitually sat in the mornings to drink her tea, there was a shape that his mind first refused to accept. He said he stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not know how long, holding the lantern, before he understood what he was looking at. His wife's head leaned back against the chair's spindles, her eyes closed, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, her expression in the flickering lantern light entirely peaceful. Her left arm lay draped over the arm of the chair, the hand white and intact. A small silver ring on the 4th finger, the ring her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Her right stocking foot extended forward, as if she had been in the act of rising, and everything else, everything between the base of her neck and her ankles, was gone, in its place, filling the seat of the rocking chair and spreading across the floorboards in a neat oval measuring. The coroner would later record, 31 inches by 19 inches, was a deposit of fine pale gray ash. The ash held at its center the unmistakable curve of a ribcage, the suggestion of a pelvis, the bent line of a femur. It was, Daniel said, as if his wife had been poured into the chair, and the chair had kept the shape. He did not scream. He did not run. He stood for what felt like a very long time. Then he turned around, walked back through the front parlor, opened the front door, and walked 3/4 of a mile through knee-deep snow to the widow brewer's house. He asked her, in a voice she described as utterly calm, if she would be so good as to come and look at something. The widow came. She was not a woman who required much persuading when a neighbor appeared before dawn. She brought the hired man from the adjoining farm, a Palatine German named Jost Kieserich, who had been awake in the barn milking his cows by lantern light. Jost brought his younger brother, Hendrik, who rode the sled track north to Breakabeen to fetch the doctor. By 10 in the morning, 4 men and the widow stood in the Paine kitchen, and none of them could speak. The kitchen by daylight was almost ordinary. A square room, perhaps 14 feet on a side, floored with planks worn smooth by 3 generations of Paine feet, a large pine table in the center, a dry sink against the east wall, a cupboard against the north wall containing the household's modest collection of dishes. The cast iron stove against the south wall, its belly still cold, its door closed, the small brass draft lever at its base still open to the position Ruth must have set before she fell asleep. Above the stove, on a wooden rack, hung a row of copper pans polished to a dull shine. Against the west wall, beneath a window curtained with unbleached muslin, stood the rocking chair, and in the rocking chair was what remained of Ruth Paine. Dr. Hendrik van Dusen, who arrived from Breakabeen just after 9, was a country physician of 54 years, a graduate of the Fairfield Medical College in central New York. A man who had delivered perhaps 400 babies, set perhaps 1,000 broken bones, and signed perhaps 600 death certificates. He had seen, he believed, every way a human being could die in Schoharie County. He had not seen this. The stove, he noted in his report that afternoon in careful pencil, was stone cold to the touch. He laid his hand on top of it for a full minute to be certain. The floor around the oval of ash was unburned. The wooden arms of the rocking chair were scorched only where they would have contacted the body, and the scorching was shallow, not more than a music an eighth of an inch deep, as if someone had passed a hot iron lightly over the wood and then taken it away. The curtain at the window 2 feet from the chair was intact. A stack of kindling in the wood box beside the stove 3 feet from the chair was intact. A folded copy of the previous week's Schoharie Republican on the table 4 feet from the chair was intact. The doctor could read the headline about a proposed railroad extension to Combustion without turning the paper over. Ruth Paine's head, hair, face, and eyelashes, the doctor wrote in the careful hand of a man trying very hard not to commit to any conclusion he could not defend, were perfectly preserved, as if she had fallen asleep in her chair and never woken up. There was no grimace of pain, no soot on her cheeks. The small silver cross she wore on a chain around her neck had fallen back into the neckline of her nightdress. What remained of it? The chain itself was intact and bright. The temperature required to reduce a human torso to calcined ash is not a matter of medical opinion. It is physics. A cremation furnace in 1879 operated at a minimum of 400 degrees Fahrenheit and required 2 to 3 hours of sustained, directed heat to reduce a body to the condition in which Ruth Paine was found. No fire of that intensity could have burned within 3 feet of unscorched wood. No fire of that duration could have left her face and hair untouched, and no fire known to medical science in the winter of 1879 could have confined itself so precisely to the soft tissue of a single human trunk. The doctor closed his notebook. The widow crossed herself in the Catholic manner, despite being a lifelong Methodist, and only afterward realized she had done it. Jost Kieserich, who had fought at Gettysburg as a boy of 19 and seen men burned in the aftermath, walked outside into the snow and was sick against the side of the barn. When he came back inside, his face was gray, and he did not meet anyone's eye. A discussion took place that afternoon among the men in the kitchen. Dr. Van Dusen wanted to send for the county sheriff. Jost Kieserich, whose English was rough but whose judgment was sound, agreed. Daniel Paine, sitting on a stool in the corner, with his hands folded between his knees, and his eyes fixed on the floor, said quietly that he did not want his wife's remains, what was left of her, to become a public spectacle. She had been a modest woman, he said. She would not have wanted to be stared at. He said, in the same quiet voice, that the affliction that had taken her was of a rare and terrible kind, a medical accident, and that the proper authority was not the sheriff, but the coroner. The coroner could make his determination without curious neighbors. Dr. Van Dusen, who had watched Daniel closely through this speech, later wrote in a private letter to a colleague in Utica that he had never, in 30 years of country practice, seen a recently widowed man speak of his wife's remains with such precise and premeditated calm. If he had been a man of suspicious temperament, he might have taken that calm as evidence. But he was not a suspicious man. He was a tired country doctor in the hardest winter of his life, standing in a kitchen where something impossible had occurred. He did what tired country doctors usually do see. He accepted the husband's wishes. He sent Hendrik Kieserich again on the sled track, not for the sheriff, but for the coroner. And he sat with Daniel, the widow, and Jost in the front parlor of the Paine farmhouse, the kitchen door closed, and a sheet draped over the rocking chair, until the coroner arrived late that evening. By then, in the dry, cold air of the kitchen, the ash had begun very slightly to sift through the cracks between the floorboards. In the weeks that followed, the story of what had happened in the Paine kitchen spread through Schoharie County the way cold spreads through a stone wall, slowly and from every direction at once. The Schoharie Republican ran a short notice on February 16th describing the death as a sudden misfortune of unexplained cause and expressing the community's condolences to Deacon Paine. The Combustion Index 3 days later called it a probable apoplexy followed by accidental fire. The diagnosis Dr. Van Dusen had settled on after 2 sleepless nights and did not himself believe. The Albany Argus, which had a correspondent in the county seat and was willing to risk a little sensationalism, printed a longer piece on February 22nd in which the word combustion appeared for the first time, carefully qualified by spontaneous. The piece was reprinted in edited form in 3 other regional papers over the following week. The story might have ended there, filed away as a curiosity in the back pages of a county paper, if not for a physician from Albany named Dr. Cornelius Ten Eyck. He read the Argus piece over his breakfast coffee on the morning of February 23rd, and by that same evening was on the train west with a leather satchel full of instruments and an unshakable conviction that he had just been handed the case that would make his career. Dr. Ten Eyck was 44 years old, a professor of forensic medicine at the Albany Medical College, a man whose professional ambition was matched only by his contempt for country doctors. He had published 7 papers on unusual modes of death, including a widely cited study of accidental poisonings among Troy factory workers and a controversial monograph on infant asphyxiation among the urban poor. He had been waiting for more than a decade for a specimen of what the medical literature of the time called preternatural human combustion. By the count of medical journals in 1879, some 30 documented cases had occurred in Europe and North America over the preceding century, almost all involving elderly women, heavy drinkers, and confined spaces. The case of the Countess Cornelia Bandy of Cesena in 1731 was the canonical reference cited in every textbook. Ruth Paine, at 26 years old, a teetotaler, a woman in visibly good health only days before her death, did not fit the pattern. For Dr. Ten Eyck, that was precisely the point. He arrived in Cobble Hollow on the morning of February 25th, 11 days after Ruth's death. He traveled from the Break-A-Bin station by hired sleigh, wrapped in a bearskin robe, his satchel at his feet. He would later describe the approach to the hamlet as the strangest visual impression of his adult life. Snow had begun again during the night. The 7 houses of Cobble Hollow stood in a rough line along the frozen brook, their dark roofs frosted white, their chimneys smoking in thin gray plumes. Beyond them, the hills rose in long pale folds under a slate-colored sky. There was no sound except the creak of the sleigh runners and the horse's breath. Not a dog barked. Not a child shouted. The hamlet looked, he wrote, like an engraving from a German fairy tale. The kind in which something terrible has just happened inside one of the small, tidy houses, and no one has as yet noticed. He was met at the door of the Paine farmhouse by Daniel, who had not, as far as anyone in the hamlet could tell, wept once in the intervening 11 days. Daniel was tall, 6 feet and some inches, with the long, slightly stooped frame of a man who had spent most of his adult life bending over plows and fence rails. His hair was sandy brown, thinning at the crown, combed severely back from a high forehead. His eyes were pale blue, widely set, and they held, Dr. Paine noted in his first diary entry about the case, the particular flat quality of eyes that have stopped expecting anything. Daniel shook the doctor's hand, took his coat, and led him through the parlor into the kitchen, without speaking a single unnecessary word. The rocking chair was still there against the west wall, beneath the muslin, curtained window. The oval of ash had been swept up, placed in a sealed wooden box roughly the size of a hat box, and kept at the county coroner's instruction in an unheated outbuilding behind the farmhouse. The scorched floorboards had been scrubbed with lye soap but not replaced. The dark oval stain was still clearly visible beneath Daniel's boots. Dr. Paine set his satchel on the pine table and looked slowly around the kitchen. As he looked, he began to notice things the country doctor had missed, things that would, in the weeks to come, unravel the entire story. First, the rocking chair was not in its natural position. It had been moved before Ruth's death, perhaps 3 feet forward from the wall, into an open area where there was no obvious reason for it. The natural position, given the room's layout and the stove's warmth, was against the wall where it now stood. But the faint wear patterns hem music on the floor showed it had been dragged forward and then returned. Second, the cupboard directly behind the chair. A tall pine cupboard with 2 upper and 2 lower doors, contained in its lower compartment a set of ceramic jugs that were, when he opened the door and lifted one, far lighter than they should have been. Daniel asked what had been in them, said coal oil for the lamps, but he had used up the supply during the long winter nights. Dr. Paine, who had counted the jugs and noted their combined capacity, did not say what he was thinking. Third, the floor beneath the rocking chair, where the scorched oval stain was not centered in the kitchen but offset, pushed away from the stove and toward the window. Fourth, the rag rug that had always, according to the widow brewer's later testimony, lain under the rocking chair, had disappeared in the past several months and had not been replaced. Fifth, the small pedestal table that had always stood beside the chair, on which Ruth kept her tea and her book, was also missing. Daniel said he had broken it up for kindling. In a winter as hard as that one, no one found this remarkable. Dr. Paine made a small careful note in his pocketbook and said nothing. Over the next 3 days, Dr. Paine measured every surface in the kitchen, collected ash samples, interviewed Daniel, the widow brewer, Jost Kieserich, and the Methodist chapel minister. He rode the sled track to Breakabin to examine the house where Ruth had grown up. He spent an afternoon in the small records office at the county seat, examining deed books, tax rolls, and the marriage register for the past 10 years. what he found, and wrote in the unpublished notebook that survived him and was purchased 61 years later by a private collector in Cooperstown. Has never been reproduced in any medical journal. The notebook runs to 187 pages in Dr. Ten Eyck's cramped, educated hand. It contains, among many other things, 3 observations that he would eventually see as the pillars of the entire case. The first observation, recorded on the second day of his stay, was that Ruth Paine had in her final month purchased from the general store in Breakabin a total of 19 gallons of coal oil, a kerosene-based lamp fuel widely used in rural New York. 19 gallons far exceeded what the Paine household could have consumed for lighting. A normal farmhouse with 3 or 4 lamps used perhaps 2 gallons a month in winter. The Paine household had only 2 lamps. Daniel, pressed, could not account for the discrepancy. He said his wife handled household purchases. He had not noticed. He said she had once mentioned varnishing furniture in the spring, and the oil might have been intended for that. Dr. Ten Eyck wrote a single word in the margin beside this entry, "Who plausible." The second observation, recorded on the third day, was that Ruth had been observed by at least 2 witnesses wearing a corset of a new style, recently advertised in Godey's Lady's Book. A garment whose stays were reinforced with a paste of calcium phosphate and animal fat, a substance, Dr. Ten Eyck noted in careful Latin, highly susceptible to forming phosphorus compounds under prolonged body heat. The corset had been a gift, the widow brewer said. Ruth had shown it to her in October, laid out in its box with a ribbon around it, and said, in a voice the widow remembered as unusually quiet, that it had come from a gentleman admirer of many years ago, who had sent it as a token of continued friendship. The widow had not asked who the gentleman was. She had seen Ruth wear the corset several times afterward under a black wool dress that Ruth had taken to wearing in the evenings when she expected no visitors. The third observation, the one Dr. Ten Eyck underlined twice and then, in a different ink and apparently much later, circled 3 times, was this: Ruth Paine was, at the time of her death, in the early weeks of a pregnancy, and that pregnancy, according to dates Dr. Ten Eyck carefully reconstructed from the widow's testimony and 3 letters he was eventually permitted to read, could not possibly have been her husband's child. If this story is already making you think twice about what people in small towns can hide, take a moment to like this video and let us know in the comments what you think happened in that kitchen, because the records we are about to discuss were sealed for a reason. What Dr. Ten Eyck learned next is why that seal was put in place, and why no one in Cobble Hollow or in Albany ever spoke Ruth Paine's name again in any public setting for the remainder of the century. Dr. Ten Eyck returned to Albany on February 28th and began, with the methodical patience of a man who had waited his whole career for exactly this, to assemble the rest of the story. He wrote letters to every address in the bundle of correspondence Daniel had grudgingly allowed him to examine. He interviewed, over the next 4 months, every person in the Mohawk Valley who had known Ruth Vosburgh before her marriage. He traveled twice to New York City to consult a colleague at Bellevue Hospital Medical College on the chemistry of slow combustion. He spent a week in the Albany County Public Records Office. He sent a young assistant to copy from the dusty ledgers of a small State Street printing shop every name recoverable from the account books of a certain quarterly publication printed there between 1870 and 1875. By the end of the summer of 1879, he had constructed a picture of Ruth Paine's life that was, to anyone who had known only the quiet minister's daughter and dutiful farmer's wife of Cobble Hollow, almost entirely unrecognizable. Ruth Vosburgh, before her marriage, had been a member of a small and discreet society in Albany that met in the back rooms of that same printing shop on State Street. The society described itself in letters Dr. Ten Eyck was permitted to copy as a circle for the advancement of rational womanhood. It was composed of teachers, a handful of unmarried daughters of merchant families, 2 journalists, and 1 physician. A woman named Dr. Harriet de Forest, who had taken her medical degree in Geneva, Switzerland, 20 years earlier and practiced without a New York State license from a consulting room above a milliner's shop on Broadway. The circle read the works of Frances Wright and Margaret Fuller. They corresponded with a similar society in Boston and a smaller group in Rochester, associated with the suffragist movement. They produced on a small hand press in the back room a quarterly pamphlet called The Reasoned Voice, of which no complete run survives in any public library, and in ways the surviving letters only hint at. They provided certain forms of practical assistance to women who found themselves in circumstances that the law and the churches of Albany would not officially acknowledge. What exactly those forms of assistance were, Dr. Ten Eyck was careful not to set down in writing, even in his private notebook. But from the pattern of the letters, from Dr. de Forest's particular credentials, and from the fact that 3 women named in the shop's account books had died in the intervening years under circumstances officially recorded as female complaints. Any reader of the notebook who understands the medical realities of the 1870s can draw his own conclusions. Ruth had left this society abruptly and without explanation in the autumn chamber music of 1875. Within weeks of meeting Daniel Paine at the Grange Hall, she music dance. Dr. Ten Eyck came to believe she left because she had been seen at a meeting by a man who recognized her and threatened. In some manner the surviving letters do not make explicit to expose her. Who that man was, Dr. Ten Eyck could not at first determine, but one of the letters he obtained, written to Ruth by Dr. de Forest in November 1878, 3 months before Ruth's death, contained a single sentence that would eventually lead him to the answer. The sentence read, "I fear, dear Ruth, that the gentleman from Combustion Hollow has not forgotten you. And if he should come to the house on Broadway again, I cannot promise that I will be able to send him away a second time." The gentleman from Combustion Hollow was not Daniel Paine. Daniel Paine had never been to Albany in his life. The gentleman from Combustion Hollow was, as Dr. Ten Eyck confirmed through the laborious process of tracing property deeds and crop records in the Schoharie County Archive and checking them against Albany's commercial directory, a man named Augustus Voorhees. He was 48 years old, a textile merchant who owned a substantial summer house 3 miles from the Paine farm, and spent June through September in the hamlet every year. Augustus Heer Music Voorhees was a man of considerable local reputation. He was the 3rd generation of a Dutch mercantile family that had been trading wool and cotton out of Albany since before the War of 1812. He was a member of the Albany Chamber of Commerce, a trustee of 2 banks, a communicant of the Second Reformed Church, and the owner of a 4-story brick house on Washington Avenue in the better part of the city. He was married to a woman of fragile health who rarely left the Washington Avenue house. He had 3 grown daughters, all married to respectable men. By every measurable standard of the 1870s, he was a man of unblemished public character. He was also, and this was the detail that made Dr. Ten Eyck set down his pen and sit staring out his study window on the evening of July 2, 1879, the uncle of Daniel Paine's first wife. He was the man who had introduced Daniel to his first wife 12 years earlier at a family picnic at his summer house in Cobble Hollow. He had paid out of his own pocket for the carved marble headstone that stood in the Cobble Hollow churchyard over that first wife's grave. And he was by the testimony of the widow Brewer, when Dr. Ten Eyck pressed her a second time. Plain as day, the man seen entering the Paine farmhouse on at least 4 occasions during the summer and autumn of 1878. Always while Daniel was out in the far pasture, always staying more than an hour, always leaving without speaking to anyone in the hamlet. He was the man whose voice the widow would eventually confess to Dr. Ten Eyck in a whispered conversation on her back porch on the afternoon of July 15, 1879, that she had recognized as the third voice raised in argument in the Paine farmhouse in the small hours of the night. 3 times in the final months of Ruth's life. Dr. Ten Eyck was not by temperament a man who jumped to conclusions. He spent the autumn of 1879 assembling what he had learned into a careful scientific monograph, intending to present it before the Albany Academy of Medicine in January of the following year. The monograph argued, with great care and an abundance of chemical diagrams, that Ruth Paine had died of a rare, but not unprecedented, conjunction of physiological and environmental circumstances. It proposed that the calcium phosphate in her corset stays, warmed by prolonged body heat, and the vapors of the 19 gallons of coal oil stored, he had discovered in the course of his investigation, in a cupboard directly behind her chair, had undergone a slow chemical transformation, producing small quantities of white phosphorus. This phosphorus, ignited either by a stray ember from the stove or by a momentary frictional spark from her own movement in the chair, had initiated a slow combustion confined to the fatty tissues of her torso, a process similar to what was then known among undertakers as the wick effect. It proposed, in its final pages and with considerable delicacy, that the unusually low body temperature of a woman in the first weeks of pregnancy, combined with the unusually low ambient temperature of that February night, had somehow permitted the combustion to proceed without igniting the surrounding materials. It was in its way a remarkable piece of work. It was also, by the standards of any modern forensic pathologist, almost entirely wrong. And Dr. Ten Eyck in the last weeks of 1879 was beginning to suspect as much himself, because in the course of writing the monograph, he had returned to Cobble Hollow one final time on December 12, 1879, nearly 10 months after Ruth's death, and had interviewed for 2 hours in the back parlor of the widow Brewer's house a hired girl named Margaret Kieserich, the 15-year-old niece of Jost Kieserich. She had worked in the Paine kitchen 3 days a week throughout the autumn of 1878. Margaret was a slight, dark-haired girl who spoke English haltingly. She had refused to speak to Dr. Van Dusen in February and to Dr. Ten Eyck on his previous visits. She had changed her mind, she told the widow, because she had begun to have dreams. In the dreams, she stood in the snow outside the Paine farmhouse, and Ruth Paine looked at her through the kitchen window. Ruth Paine was trying to tell her something, and Margaret could not hear. The dreams came every night, Margaret said. She had not slept through a night since early summer. She was losing weight. Her mother, who did not know the reason, had begun to fear for her health. Margaret said she had decided to speak because she believed that if she did not, the dreams would kill her, the way the silence of the hamlet had killed Ruth Paine. What Margaret told him, in low Palatine German that the widow translated sentence by sentence, changed everything. Margaret said that on the evening of February 13th, the night before Ruth was found dead, she had been sent to the Paine farmhouse at dusk to deliver a jar of preserves from her aunt. It had been snowing lightly. The last daylight was leaving the sky. The path between the houses had been trackless. Margaret had taken nearly half an hour to cover a distance that normally would have taken 10 minutes. She knocked at the front door. No one answered. She waited. She knocked again, more loudly, her knuckles stinging in the cold. She thought she heard through the heavy door a man's voice speaking sharply in the kitchen, but she could not be sure. When no one came, she walked around the side of the house to the kitchen window, intending to leave the jar on the porch, where Mrs. Paine would see it in the morning. Through the window above the dry sink, whose curtain on that evening was drawn back rather than closed, Margit saw 3 people inside. Ruth Paine was sitting in the rocking chair. Daniel Paine was standing by the stove with his back to her, his broad shoulders hunched, his arms folded tight across his chest, in the posture, Margit said, of a man making himself stand still. And a third man. A man Margit had seen in the hamlet the previous summer at a gathering at the summer house. A man she knew as Augustus Voorhees was standing directly in front of Ruth with something in his hands. Margit could not see clearly what the thing was, only that it was small and dark. Augustus Voorhees was leaning forward, speaking to Ruth in a voice too low to hear through the glass. Ruth looked up at him. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face wore an expression Margit had never seen on a grown woman's face before. An expression she described, fumbling for the word in her 2 poor languages, as the look of a rabbit that has just understood the snare. The 3 figures held that tableau for several seconds, Margit said. Then Augustus Voorhees reached out with one hand and took hold of Ruth's wrist. Ruth did not pull away. Daniel did not turn around. Augustus Voorhees spoke a single word, Margit thought, in a harder and louder voice than before, though the glass muffled it. Ruth nodded once, closed her eyes. Margit ran back to her aunt's house without leaving the preserves. The jar was later found frozen solid in a snowdrift at the edge of the Paine property, where Margit had dropped it in her flight. She told no one, not even her aunt, because Augustus Voorhees had once given her father a loan during a bad harvest year that her father had not yet repaid, and because a girl of 15 in Cobble Hollow in 1878 did not accuse a wealthy merchant from Albany of anything. She was telling him now, the doctor from the city, because she could not sleep, and because the face she had seen through the kitchen window had become the face she saw behind her own eyelids every night, and because she believed, though she could not prove it, and did not expect the doctor to believe her, that whatever had happened in that kitchen after she ran away had not been an accident, had not been a natural thing, and had not been anything the chemistry in the doctor's books would ever explain. Just when we thought we understood what happened to Ruth Paine, the horror in Cobble Hollow begins to take a different shape entirely. If this story is holding you in its grip, share this video with someone who loves the darker corners of American history. Hit that like button to support what we do here, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Then let us follow Dr. Ten Eyck into the last act of this tragedy, because what he did with what Margit told him is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire case. The part that for more than a century, no one was willing to put on the public record. Dr. Ten Eyck returned to Albany on the evening of December 14, 1879, carrying in his satchel the notes of his interview with Margit Kieserich and a small muslin bag containing a sample of the ash swept from the Paine kitchen floor 10 months before. He went not to his house on Elk Street, where his wife waited with a late supper, but to his laboratory on the 2nd floor of the medical college. Working through the night by the light of 2 gas burners, he performed a series of chemical tests on the ash that he had not had the opportunity, or perhaps the motivation, to perform before. He tested for standard combustion residues. He tested for the specific compounds expected from the wick effect theory. He tested, on a hunch he would afterwards be unable to explain, for compounds associated with industrial and military accelerants. What he found by 3 in the morning of December 15th was this: the ash contained, in quantities that could not plausibly come from human tissue alone, measurable traces of potassium nitrate, sulfur, and fine charcoal. The 3 ingredients of black powder, not the residue of black powder fired in a firearm or a charge, but the residue of black powder burned slowly in the open under controlled conditions, the way an apothecary or pyrotechnist might burn it to produce a specific chemical effect or a specific quantity of directed heat. Dr. Ten Eyck sat at his laboratory bench for a long time that night. He put out the gas burners one after another and sat in the dark. The first gray light of morning found him still sitting there, his hands folded on the bench before him. He understood now what had been done to Ruth Paine. He understood that the heat required to reduce her torso to ash in the observed time without igniting the surrounding room could only have been produced by a deliberate and expert application of a slow, burning accelerant packed in and around her body, probably while she was unconscious or restrained, and ignited in a manner that directed the heat inward rather than outward. He understood that the Wick effect his monograph was about to defend had been a red herring, almost certainly planted deliberately through the calcium phosphate corset and the 19 gallons of coal oil by someone who understood enough of contemporary medical theory to know what investigators would look for and what they would accept as an explanation. He understood that the agent of combustion had been human, not natural. He understood that the work required knowledge of chemistry that a country farmer like Daniel Paine could not have possessed, but that a textile merchant who bought and sold dyestuffs, bleaching agents, and industrial accelerants across 3 states, a man like Augustus Voorhees, could have acquired without great difficulty. And he understood, finally, and with a kind of cold clarity that made him put down his pen and walk out into the snow on State Street at 4 in the morning, that what he had been investigating for the past 10 months was not a case of preternatural combustion at all. It was a murder, executed with extraordinary care and disguised as a wonder of science to ensure that no one would ever look for a murderer. He walked that morning from the medical college all the way home to his house on Elk Street, nearly 2 miles, through streets empty except for the milkman's wagon and a few lamplighters extinguishing the last gas lamps. He did not feel the cold. His mind was working through problems whose dimensions he was only beginning sheer music to understand. If he made his finding public, what would happen to Ruth Paine's memory? Whose affair and pregnancy would become the central fact of the story? Whose killers might well escape prosecution on technicalities? If he went to the sheriff of Schoharie County, in a county where Augustus Voorhees was a long-standing political donor and a personal friend of 2 sitting judges, whom would the sheriff actually investigate? If he wrote to the district attorney in Albany with his evidence, the ash, the notebook, Dr. D. Forrest's letters, would he be believed? A medical professor pursuing a private theory against a trustee of 2 banks. And behind all these questions, pressing forward in the dim December morning, was a question about himself. Dr. Cornelius Ten Eyck was 44 years old. His career had been solid but not brilliant. He had wanted the Albany Medical College chair of forensic medicine for a decade, and had been passed over twice for younger men with better connections. He had 3 children in school, fees that strained his resources, an ailing mother in Schenectady whose care he was quietly paying for. He was a man with a family, a reputation, and a mortgage, and he was about to try to bring a criminal prosecution against a man who could, with a single letter on the right stationery, Destroy every one of those things without leaving any visible fingerprints. What Dr. Paine did next is the part of this story that has been debated by the few scholars who have ever known enough about the case to debate anything. For nearly a century and a half, he did not go to the sheriff of Schoharie County. He did not publish his findings. He did not, as far as any record shows, speak of them to another living soul. Not to his wife, not to his colleagues at the medical college, not to the young assistant who had helped him prepare the chemical tests and who was afterwards sent away on an unexpected teaching assignment in Binghamton. He did, on the morning of December 17, 1879, write a letter to Augustus Voorhees at his residence in Combustion Hollow. The letter itself has not survived, though Dr. Paine made oblique reference to it in a single line of his notebook, dated December 17th. The line reads only, "Letter sent to A.V. at the Hamlet. Certain matters laid before him in confidence. Response awaited." But the reply that Augustus Voorhees wrote 3 days later, on December 20th, on heavy cream letterhead from the Voorhees Textile Company of Albany, was found folded carefully into the back. Torture and music. Torture of Dr. Paine's private notebook 61 years later when the notebook was purchased at auction. The reply is 11 lines long. It thanks Dr. Paine for his discretion. It expresses confidence that the doctor understands the painful necessity of certain private arrangements when the reputations of families, the stability of communities, and the honor of the deceased herself are at stake. It promises, in language so courteous that it takes a moment to understand what it is promising, that Dr. Paine's advancement within the medical profession of New York will henceforth be assured. It mentions, as if in passing and almost as an afterthought, that a vacancy has recently opened on the Board of Trustees of the Albany Medical College, and that the board has been considering candidates of suitable distinction. The writer's own modest influence with 2 of the sitting trustees would, should the doctor find himself inclined to accept such a position, be placed entirely at the doctor's disposal. It closes with the warm regards and high esteem of a loyal friend who looks forward sincerely to their next meeting. Dr. Paine did not attend the meeting of the Albany Academy of Medicine in January 1880. He did not deliver his monograph. He withdrew the paper from the program without explanation, citing in a brief note to the Academy secretary, "Unforeseen circumstances of a personal nature." He filed his notes, folded the letter into the back of his notebook, placed the notebook in a locked drawer of his desk, and over the following year was quietly appointed to the Board of Trustees of the Albany Medical College. He served on that board for 22 years. He published 4 more papers on unusual modes of death, none concerning the case of Ruth Paine. He died of a stroke in the spring of 1901 at age 66, in his armchair in his Albany study, the evening newspaper folded across his knees. The notebook was found by his granddaughter, a schoolteacher named Elizabeth Paine, in the bottom of a cedar trunk in the attic of the family home on Elk Street in the summer of 1940, during the emptying of the house after her own father's death. She read it through in a single afternoon, sitting on an overturned box in the dusty heat of the attic. She did not speak of it to her brothers. She sold it 3 months later to a private collector in Cooperstown for $75. The collector was, as it happens, a distant cousin of the Voorhees family of Albany. The notebook has been in his descendants' collection ever since. The records of the Ruth Paine case, the ones that should have been filed in the Schoharie County Courthouse, the coroner's report, the physician's affidavits, Daniel Paine's deposition, Jos Kieserich's brief sworn statement given 2 days after the body was discovered, do not exist. They did exist once. Dr. Ten Eyck cites them in his notebook with specific file numbers and dates. But in the summer of 1880, 6 months after Dr. Ten Eyck received his appointment to the Medical College Board, the Schoharie County Courthouse suffered a small fire in its basement archive. The fire was contained to a single storage room. It was attributed in the county fire marshal's brief report to a defective kerosene lamp left burning overnight in a corridor outside the archive. It destroyed, according to a brief notice in the Schoharie Republican on August 9, 1880, a quantity of miscellaneous papers of no great consequence. The papers included the entire coroner's file for February 1879. They also included the entire docket of property transactions involving the Voorhees family for 1877 through 1879, the marriage register for the Combustion, Hollow Methodist Chapel for the same period, and the complete run of local tax assessments on the Paine farm for the 5 years preceding Ruth's death. No other records in the archive were damaged. The defective kerosene lamp, extensively mentioned in the fire marshal's report, was never produced as evidence. The corridor, where it had supposedly been left burning, was never, according to the courthouse janitor, who read the marshal's report 3 years later and shook his head at it, a corridor where any lamp was ever kept. Daniel Paine sold the farm in the autumn of 1880 to a buyer who paid considerably above market rate. The buyer was represented in the transaction by a law firm with offices on Washington Avenue in Albany. The firm had represented the Voorhees Textile Company in matters of incorporation and taxation for the previous 15 years. Daniel moved to a small town in western Pennsylvania called Mercer, where he remarried 2 years later, fathered 3 children, and lived out his life as a respected elder of a Presbyterian congregation. He died in 1914 at age 70. His obituary in the local paper mentioned a first wife who had died tragically in a house fire in New York State, and did not mention her name. His second wife, according to a granddaughter interviewed by a folklorist in 1968, said only that Daniel had been a good husband, but a silent one. In the last years of his life, he took to sitting up in the kitchen of their Mercer house until 2 or 3 in the morning, alone with a single lamp burning, looking at nothing. Once, the granddaughter said, her grandmother had come down in the night to find him weeping silently, his face in his hands. When she put her arm around his shoulders and asked what was wrong, he said only, "I did not turn around. I should have turned around." He never explained what he meant. He never said it again. Augustus Voorhees continued to summer in Cobble Hollow for another 15 years. He expanded the textile company, opened a second office in Boston, and served 1 term in the New York State Senate, where his principal legislative achievement was a bill raising penalties for the corruption of public morals. In 1903, he endowed a chair in moral philosophy at a small college in Schoharie County. The endowment stipulated that the holder of the chair was to deliver, once each year, a public lecture on the Christian virtues, music of temperance, chastity, and reserve. He died in 1909 at age 70, 8 of complications following minor surgery. He is buried beneath a white marble monument in the Combustion Hollow churchyard, within sight of the smaller weathered stone that marks Ruth Paine's grave. The inscription on his monument reads, "A merchant of integrity, a friend of virtue, a pillar of the community." The inscription on Ruth's stone, which Daniel ordered and paid for before selling the farm and leaving for Pennsylvania, reads only, wife 1852 to 1879. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. The widow Brewer died in 1884 of pneumonia in her own bed at age 67. She had kept, until the end of her life, a sealed envelope in the top drawer of her bureau addressed to the Schoharie County District Attorney. Its contents were never disclosed to her family. When discovered after her death, It was opened by her eldest son and, without being read aloud, thrown into the kitchen stove. Margaret Kieserich married a farmer from the next county in 1883, raised 5 children, and lived until 1931. Her neighbors regarded her as unusually quiet. In the last year of her life, she told one of her granddaughters, without any context at all, that there were things a person could see through a kitchen window that they should never have seen, and that they never afterward stopped seeing. The Notebook of Dr. Ten Eyck is today in the archive of a small private historical society in upstate New York that has chosen not to permit its reproduction or public display. According to a statement issued by the Society's Board of Trustees in 1987, the document contains material of a deeply sensitive nature concerning identifiable families of the region whose descendants continue to live in the county. The ash of Ruth Paine, in its sealed wooden box, was buried in an unmarked corner of the Cobble Hollow churchyard in the summer of 1880, at the instruction of the then presiding minister of the Methodist chapel, whose name has not survived. The pages of the chapel register covering 1878 through 1881 were, like the coroner's file at the courthouse, destroyed at some point in the late 19th century. What was done to Ruth Paine on the night of February 13, 1879, was done by at least 2 men. In a locked kitchen on the coldest night of a hard winter, in a hamlet at the end of a road closed by snow. It was done to a young woman who had once, before her marriage, belonged to a circle of other young women who believed the future would be different from the past, and who, when threatened, chose to leave that circle and accept a quiet life in a place where no one would ever come looking for her. It was done, almost certainly, because she was pregnant with a child that was not her husband's. Because the father of that child was a man who could not afford. At 40, ate with a sick wife on Washington Avenue, 3 married daughters, and a reputation built over 3 generations of careful Dutch commerce. To have the fact known, it was done with chemistry borrowed from the textile trade, potassium nitrate, sulfur, and fine charcoal packed around the body of an unconscious woman in a rocking chair. It was disguised as a wonder of science to ensure that the only people who might investigate it would be so dazzled by the prospect of a medical sensation that they would not think to look for a criminal. It was compounded by the quiet cooperation of a husband who had either been broken by the discovery of his wife's affair or been promised something he wanted more than his wife, or both, and who stood in his own kitchen with his back turned while another man put his hands on her. It was concealed, finally, by the purchase of one ambitious physician's conscience, by a small convenient fire in a basement archive, and by the slow, impatient passage of 147 years of forgetting. This mystery shows us that the most terrible things that have happened in this country have not been done by monsters from beyond the edge of the world. They have been done by ordinary men in ordinary rooms in ordinary towns, protected by the ordinary silences of the people around them, and hidden, finally, by history's willingness to let certain names, certain places, and certain women be quietly erased from the record. Science cannot explain what happened to Ruth Paine, not because what happened was outside the laws of nature, but because the science of her time was used, deliberately and with great skill, to cover the tracks of what had been done to her. The men who killed her understood chemistry better than the doctor who tried to save her memory. The men who protected them understood the price of a conscience better than the men whose consciences were for sale. And the community around them understood, with the terrible practical wisdom of small places, that there are questions it is better for everyone concerned never to ask aloud. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has truly been revealed? Or are there still details, still names, still letters in trunks and journals in cedar boxes, waiting to be found in some attic in upstate New York by some granddaughter who will, this time, refuse to sell? Leave your comment below. Tell us what you think Daniel Paine was doing in that kitchen, whether you believe he knew, and whether you believe there is any forgiveness for a man who stands with his back turned while someone puts their hands on his wife. If this tale has held you, subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss what we uncover next. Share this video with someone who understands that the darkest history is not the history we were taught in school, but the history that someone, somewhere, once went to very great trouble to ensure we would never hear. See you in the next video.